And in the meantime, I would like to welcome you back to the second panel of the conference that should bridge theory with research, mostly empirical research as well. The session is kindly chaired by Peter Seixas. He is a professor of the University of British Columbia, Faculty of Education, and he is also the founding director of the Center for the Study of Historical Consciousness. He is the right person to bridge this gap because he stands on both sides, I would say, coming there and back, empirical research and theory, but also very active and influential in didactics and pedagogy. He looks a lot into historical consciousness, and I would like to use this opportunity to thank him for being an active member of the program committee. The same thing applies to Felicitas McGilchrist as well. So, Mr. Seixas, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very.
Just press it.
Thank you very much. This is a tremendous honor to be here in this beautiful city and with such a stimulating program. I'm very excited to be here, but I have to be very brief, and I'm going to time the speakers very carefully. I've brought new technology to keep them on track, and I will try to keep on track myself. The first speaker, keynote speaker for this session is Felicitas McGilchrist. Dr. McGilchrist is a research fellow at the Georg Eckert Institute for International Textbook Research in Braunschweig, Germany, where she is deputy head of the Textbooks as Media Department. She is project leader of the Memory Practices Research Group, which explores how cultural memory is enacted and contested in contemporary history education. Further research interests include textbook production, educational governance, ethnography, and post-structuralist discourse theory. Dr. McGilchrist.
So, thank you very much, Peter. Do we have the slides? Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much. I'm delighted to be able to speak here and to present some beginning research from the project which Peter just mentioned. I want today to pick up some ideas which were mentioned in the first panel already as well, on the individual and the collective. And Jakob Mliner pointed to the linguistic dimension, and I want to push that a little bit in the direction of the material dimension, which was also mentioned in one of the questions on the landscape memory, for instance. And also Manfred Weinberg mentioned that he thinks the concepts used should be perhaps more complex. Now, where Manfred Weinberg has 700 pages, I have 20 minutes. So I'm going to try to convey some complexity in 20 minutes. So to do this, I'm going to dive straight in today with three episodes from empirical research, and picking up the title of our panel, begin with research and then move in the second half of the talk to theory. So, the data... Technology? Ah, here it is. So, modern technology and memory research. So, the data I'm going to speak to today are coming from 2 school ethnographies in history classrooms and some interviews with teachers in history education. And I want to talk on 3 episodes to develop a conceptual approach to memory practices, this concept of memory practices, which I hope speaks to other research on memory in schools. Without going into more details about the project, I want to dive straight into episode 1, which I've called Reproducing Linearity for reasons I hope will become clear in the next few minutes. Now, I begin with one image which you don't need to read the details on this. I think it's familiar to all of us who work with history education in classrooms. These are the notes written by one student after a discussion among 3 students and a task in class. The topic is the economic crisis of 1923, and the events listed are primarily state-led events, but I don't want to talk about the actual contents at the moment. I want to draw your attention to these arrows, linking in a nice linear causal way, one event to the next event. And at the top we have assumptions. This was written by the teacher on the blackboard, and the student copies this down, also including the arrows drawn by the teacher. And at the bottom we have one result, singular. It all leads to one result at the bottom. So in this episode, these signs, these arrows, together with the materiality of the physical textbook, create an understanding of history, this is my suggestion, in which discrete events follow one after the other in a linear fashion. And I will return to the materiality of these classroom activities in the second half of my talk. For now, I want to hold on to the observation that in making the past present with paper and pen and textbooks and the blackboard, time is enacted as linear, history is enacted as two-dimensional. Only one thing can happen at any one given time. The linearity and the two-dimensionality interest me in this episode, in particular in light of discussions on digital humanities and the sort of observation that history in a database operates in a very different way and can open up the possibility of multiple accounts and conflicting accounts happening at the same time. And if we contrast the way of working with blackboards and texts and paper and linearity and writing on the paper to working with databases, and I've a link here at the bottom to Philip J. Etherington's classic multimodal history account of LA, where he looks in different periods and different times at the same, much more complex, multiple, three-dimensional understanding of history. So coming back to schools, the question is, would or does this kind of digital non-linear history enable the inclusion of a more diverse set of stories about any one given event? For the episode on the economic crisis of 1923, for instance, this may include other kinds of counter-memories which, unlike the textbook narrative, don't focus primarily on state-led actions, but and the kind of counter-memories which are being collectively forgotten through the focus on state-led activities and the singular linear narrative connecting these different activities. The second very brief episode I've called Hyperstating. The ethnographer, in this case, has invited a small group of students from his from the class he is accompanying in his ethnographic research, into a small group discussion. And this is their discussion. The ethnographer says, so right, we've been talking about the German Empire all the time now since I've been there. He's been in class now for 6 weeks with the students. What do you think is the most important thing that should be remembered about this topic? One student, Lars, says the most important thing, and Thomas says that Germany has always been the best country in the world. Peter laughs, Thomas laughs too. That sounded really un-nationalist there, he says. Mike says how big Germany was there and how it all came together. And Peter says the progress there, everything that happened in that period. Ethnographer again asks, what do you mean by progress exactly? Thomas said you should have paid attention during the film. I'll come back to the film in a moment. And Peter says technological. I found technological progress and in airplanes, transport, that was all developed. And the awesome shoes which you could walk across water with. This picture here are these awesome shoes which you can walk across water with. I thought they were very practical. Thomas is now laughing so much that he nearly falls off his chair. I was actually impressed, says Peter, by how much happened in such a short time. So, what is happening in this episode? I'd like to point to three things. First, Thomas says very playfully here that Germany has always been the best country in the world. The textbooks and the curricula would never say this explicitly, that Germany has been the best country in the world. The teacher would also never say explicitly that Germany has been the best country in the world. However, a careful discourse analysis of the materials, the textbook, the teacher talk, the curricula, would identify that a strong shaping coming through these materials is that, in fact, Germany has always been the best country in the world. I didn't mention this as history teaching in Germany, clearly. And I would also say this is not specific to Germany. Careful discourse analysis of materials in England also shows that for English textbooks, England always has been the best country in the world. Perhaps Czech textbooks are saying something similar. So the second point I'd like to point to is a range of elements are entangled in these statements here. These awesome shoes you can see in the picture are drawn from a documentary film the students watched in class about the German Empire. So Peter is mobilising this film in his informal chat here with the ethnographer and the other students. And the third thing I'd like to draw attention to in this, again, very brief episode is the materiality of the classroom setting, which also contributed to these shared memories. There are 6 group tables in the class. The students, 25, 30 students sit around 6 group tables. In the textbook, there are 4 group activities. Each group should learn about the nobility, the bourgeoisie, women in a male society, and industrial workers. The teacher has 6 groups, 4 group activities, so she adds 2 more activities to her classroom setting. She adds militarisation and technological progress. And Peter was in the group which focused on technological progress. So, summarising this episode very briefly, when we see, looking at making the past present in this informal ethnographic setting where there's quite a good rapport and they're having a chat, they're laughing, there is a playfulness in this dimension. He's very ironic when he says Germany is the best country in the world. However, there is also a very serious element in that he is reproducing here a very dominant narrative of technological progress, a dominant Western or global North narrative, and a dominant narrative of hierarchies. Germany is up here, and the other countries are down there somewhere else. And there's no space in this, no matter how playful it is, there's no space here for the underside, or the dark underbelly of progress, such as the global exploitation of people and of natural resources. So, episode 3, my third episode, draws from an interview with a teacher. The teacher describes a scene from a grade 9 history class. One student was supposed to give a presentation about Rosa Luxemburg and Liebknecht and brought a video clip with them. And I said, well, why not, you know. There are some good documentaries from ZDF, the German BBC, and that. And then she came with the most left-wing thing I have ever seen. So, this is, of course, very decontextualised. He talks a lot more about this episode, but for the purposes of today, I just want to draw on this one part. So what counts as worth remembering in the early years of the 20th century, the 1910s? In this episode, several elements play a role in bringing together a particular memory of that period into the classroom. First, the state curriculum states only a few key competencies. The curriculum has now been much reduced. There's only half a page with some key competencies, key dates, key names. One name mentioned is Rosa Luxemburg, but there's no more detail about what students should know about Rosa Luxemburg. The curriculum doesn't mention, for instance, socialist democracy or any kind of idea of the idealism of communism and socialism at that time, or the workers' struggle of the time. The second element is the teacher, who invited a student to give a presentation about Luxemburg and Liebknecht. Third, the student, and her bringing this left-wing material to show the class. Fourth, the video itself, which offers a particular take on Luxemburg and Liebknecht from some kind of left-wing perspective. We don't know what exactly. And fifth, assuming the student found the video online, the algorithms behind the search engine, which led to this video being found and being presented at a fairly high rank on Google page, for instance, is also part of what leads to this kind of memory coming into the classroom. And I would say this kind of memory fissures and interrupts the standard state-mediated curricular defined memory of the 1910s of the Weimar Republic in Germany, which is supposed to be thought of as worth remembering. So, the interaction among these elements which I've listed, and more elements, has in this case torn a fissure, interrupted, contested, the official knowledge stipulated by the curriculum. What the students make of this left-wing interpretation of Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, because we're in Liechtenstein Palace, is of course a quite different question, which I would postpone for the purpose of my talk today. The third episode suggests, what I would like to draw attention to just now is it suggests that the struggle over what counts as worth remembering is the same struggle over what counts as being included in a history class, which is entangled with all sorts of different cultural products, from an online video to the textbook to the curriculum. So reflecting on these three very brief episodes, basically this research is highlighting a range of school-based memory practices, from reproducing the dominant understandings of history as linear, as singular, as marching forwards through time, through a playful yet serious hyperstating, hyperstating of a dominant global north understanding of technological progress, and to a very left-wing fissuring or interruption of state-mediated cultural memory on democracy, the roots of democracy, what counts as the Weimar Republic, what should we remember of democracy in Germany at the moment. So, I've used the term memory practices a few times now already without actually defining it. So, the second part of my talk, I want to turn now to a beginning theorization or conceptualization of the concept of memory practices, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'd like to push a little bit towards the materiality of what counts as worth remembering, or what counts as a cultural memory. The concept of memory practices has popped up now throughout memory studies over the last 5 or 10 years. Basically, it's being used by a number of writers in a general sense to mean the things people do to make the past present. The concept draws our attention to practices, to the performing or enacting of cultural memory, and to the shared, apparently small, mundane things being done as memory, whether in talk, in formal talks, in chats, in classrooms, with monuments, in the landscape, etc. And with a colleague from Basel, Alexandra Binnenkade, I'm working on a more post-humanist, new materialist understanding of memory practices, one which takes practice theory seriously as a tool for thinking about research on memory. And by that, we mean what happens if we think about memory through a lens provided by recent practice theories. And here we include Gramscian hegemony theory and new materialist approaches. I've written some key names on the slide. And I want to draw attention to one ontological aspect today, and that is the role of the individual. The sociologist Barbara Mischtal is not alone when she writes that, I quote, "While it is the individual who remembers, remembering is more than just a personal act. Is it, however, the individual who remembers, or is this a particular perspective bound up in the metaphysics of individualism? And what are the implications for understanding memory in schools of troubling this individualism?" William Hurst and David Manier point to an interesting split in memory research, which I find quite fruitful. On the one hand, those studies which are interested in the production of cultural memory in films, in monuments, in books, in digital media, etc. These studies understand memory as being in the world, not in the individuals. But interestingly, these kind of studies have traditionally not been very concerned with the reception of cultural memory products. Now, Aleda Assmann tomorrow is going to, I think, connect these two aspects, so I'm looking forward to see what she says. On the other hand, studies which do look at the reception side of cultural memory, as in how are media being used, how are people engaging with textbooks or with monuments, often focus more on the individual. What are these people doing with this medium? And we see, Alexandra Binnenkade and my team and I, see memory practices as offering a way out of this binary option, which is of course not as simplistic as I've now sketched here, if it draws on some of these practice theoretical thinkings of the last few years. So, I'm going to turn very briefly now to practice theory. And one of the most widely cited definitions of practice, which is Andreas Reckwitz, who says, practice is a routinized type of behavior which consists of several elements interconnected to one another, forms of bodily activities, forms of mental activities, things and their use, a background knowledge in the form of understanding, know-how, states of emotion, and motivational knowledge. Now, I want to push this understanding of practices in three further dimensions, drawing on the episodes which I mentioned already today. So first, instead of interconnected, we want to push this towards the idea of interaction and interacting with in two ways. We draw interaction from Karen Barad's work on quantum physics. It seems to us a vivid neologism to argue that elements and agencies do not already exist in a stable form before they interconnect or interact with one another. Instead, agencies are mutually constituted in their interaction. They emerge through this interaction. Barad is quite radically post-individualist in her approach here. Agencies, she writes, are only distinct in relation to their mutual entanglement. They don't exist as individual elements. So in one sense, we push the interconnectedness of the elements we are observing towards their entanglement and their emergence as elements within a given practice. And in a second sense, this means we consider our own role as observers. Experimenting, observing, theorizing are not about intervening from the outside, but about interacting from within and as part of the phenomenon produced. In episode 2 on hyperstating, Thomas's statement that Germany has always been the best country in the world emerged within a specific constellation. The ethnographer himself was also interacting with this phenomenon that he is observing and producing, as are all the other material elements which I sketched earlier. None of these agencies or elements exists before the constellation in which they all come together. That's the argument here. Second, instead of things and their use from Rekowitz's, we want to pick up ideas about the agency of things. Things are not only passively being used by people, they, together with the other entangled elements constituting the practice, enact agency. So this decenters the human in our understanding of practice theory. Thank you. The person is certainly involved in the practice, but no more centrally than the PowerPoint presentation, the microphone, this gorgeous palace, seating arrangements, etc. Thank you, Peter. In episode 1 on reproducing linearity with the arrows on the paper, the student is holding the pen and writing the words and drawing the arrows, but the two-dimensional space on the blackboard where the teacher wrote the first words is also part of this memory practice, as is the flat paper on which the student is writing. The talk among the students, the words on the textbook page that they've been reading, the corporate design of the textbook, which means that each page has 62 lines, and the text has to be shortened or lengthened accordingly to be precisely fit this space. And the algorithm on the image database, which found the images for the page the students are working with. The third aspect about Rekowitz's understanding of practices is that Rekowitz kind of neglects the political dimension and how power relations operate within practices. And we draw here on Raymond Williams' approach to hegemony, which he understands in a Gramscian sense as a whole body of practices and expectations over the whole of living. Hegemony, and as practice, is a lived system of meanings and values. Hegemony is thus enacted by and in the memory practices which we are observing, and also in our practices of empirically observing memory. So here, the third episode on Luxembourg and the fissures in the state-mediated curricula, we can see multiple power relations in operation here. The student who is enacting the, albeit temporary, position of an expert who will provide historical knowledge about Luxembourg and Liebknecht, her selection of the video, the power of the algorithm, which I mentioned earlier, in finding the video, the materiality and multimodality of the video, which, as we know from other research, can strengthen the power, the music behind the video, can strengthen the power of the message transmitted by a video. the teacher who is telling the story in this interview, and of course the interviewer who is engaging in conversation with the teacher as part of constructing the scene. Lovely, thank you. So, to conclude, a few statements. If I were to formulate a definition, which I don't do, I don't formulate definitions, then memory practices would be something like a specific entangled material discursive doings, drawing on the definition given by Rekowitz and changing it slightly, that make the past present and are spread across several interacting agencies. That means bodily motions, forms of mental activities, material things, digital code, time, space, landscapes, voices, all sorts of other things. I've presented 3 episodes from school-based research illustrating different ways of how schooling enacts that which is worth remembering. And I've drawn on these episodes to elaborate a material or a post-humanist understanding of memory practices. The individual subject is still present in these practices, but hopefully I have managed to decenter this individual slightly from the way the individual is often thought about in memory research. The 3 ways which I've identified memory practices working in schools: reproducing a linear understanding of history, hyperstating global hierarchies, fissuring an understanding of parliamentary democracy. These are examples of how a memory practices approach, our thinking of materiality, can try and help us to look at something different in the classroom than we would have looked at if we didn't have this concept. Although memory practice is, of course, not the only concept which can lead to this kind of approach. And yes. So, final words. I would hope that these examples can illustrate the gain of turning to a material next to a linguistic approach to languages. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Felicitas. Our next speaker is Rafael Mantegazza. He teaches intercultural education at the University of Milan, Bicocca. He conceives projects and courses for teachers about the Holocaust memory and resistance. He studies the Holocaust from an educational point of view, stressing the strategies and devices used by Nazis for the construction of the exterminating subjects, that is, the willing executioners and the passive viewers, and the role of memory in the post-Holocaust society, particularly for young people, the so-called after generation. He has written books and articles about the role of music, comics, theater, novels, and poetry in the transmission of memory about the Holocaust. And he's involved in projects about memory and the Holocaust and intergenerational memory in primary schools, high schools, and colleges. Rafael.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I will talk about the memory of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, related to the new generations. Images displayed can be taught as sensorial provocation to the audience. How can we talk of memory and oblivion after Auschwitz? How can memory be used? And what are the risks of its use? What is the real meaning of remembering? To what extent should one remember? When and how does oblivion come into play? Is it possible to learn and to teach, to remember and to forget? Every year in Italy, on January the 27th, Memory Day, Italian booksellers display dozens of books on the Holocaust, only to hurriedly take them down on January the 28th. Is this the accumulation of memories that we want for our pupils, for our children? Will this storehouse of garbage make us critically reflect on the Holocaust? how can we hope that our sons and daughters will remember simply because we oblige them to? How can we hope that they will remember the Holocaust, and even that they have not personally experienced it? Is it possible to remember on behalf of another human being? Is it possible to remember events experienced by witnesses that unfortunately are gradually departing from us? And when the last witness of the Holocaust has gone, how will we remember? Memory in general, and particularly memory of the Holocaust, cannot do without the purifying function of oblivion. And attainment of oblivion demands that time should pass and not remain blocked, so that past can truly become past. Time, often a great amount of time, is needed in order to comprehend evil, especially for those who have been its innocent victims. Distance is required in order to speak about it and to talk about it and to remember it. So education to oblivion is equally as important as educating to remembrance and to memory. This means teaching young people to unblock, this is Escher, to unblock the passage of time, to open the vicious circle of repetition, both when they commit an offense, in which case they must learn to ask for forgiveness, and when they are victims of an offense, in which case they must consciously withdraw themselves from the magic circle of revenge. No offense received should lock us forever into the identity of victim, not forever. Just as no human being should remain locked in the identity acquired on committing an evil action. For instance, a person who has killed does not remain a murderer. He is not a murderer, but a person that, given particular circumstances, has killed. What is at stake here is not, of course, the legal questions of the imprescriptibility of crimes against humanity, but the psychological opportunity to avoid keeping on living in a sort of continuously relooping movie in which both victim and persecutor are trapped, remain trapped. But how can we do this? Let us imagine a boy or a girl coming back from a pilgrimage in extermination camp. This is Birkenau, a shot I made in Birkenau. Let us imagine a boy or a girl coming back from a pilgrimage in extermination camps. What will this teenager do in the following days, weeks, months? I believe there are 4 possibilities. Our boy can possibly become a neo-Nazi follower. Unfortunately, this is not inconceivable on account of the fascinating of evil we can feel in Auschwitz. A fascinating that can nurture a passion for racist ideologies and identification with the aggressor. Second, the boy can simply ignore what he has seen. He can go on living his life forgetting the experience of the pilgrimage in the extermination camp. Indifference can be the answer to the things he has seen, as unfortunately is the case with many of school experiences and contents, put on the right shelf and forgotten. Thirdly, the boy can nurture a real interest in the topic. He can read all the books by Primo Levi, Jean Marie, he can see Schindler's List. Well, in my opinion, this third option is not in itself better, is not better than the previous 2. Because also it seems more desirable. Because in my opinion, the real goal of an educational work on the Holocaust is the 4th possibility. The boy can come back and start looking around the city he lives in, trying to detect the current phase of evil, here and now. He has studied the fate of homosexuals in the Third Reich, but what about our contemporary homophobia? He has read the Nazi school books spreading racial hate in the soul of children, but what about propaganda that is now directed at children in television, cartoons, video games, also school books? He has learned about the Holocaust of disabled persons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roman Sinti people. But what about the fate of those human beings today, here and now? A boy or a girl that are able to study Holocaust as an historical fact, of course, knowing the facts, the dates, the name of the cities, the men, the camps, and to use this knowledge to look around and understand our current racism, intolerance, violence, this boy is realizing the hope of Benedetto Croce when he wrote, "History is always a contemporary fact." But the short circuit between emotions and reason is given by our body. We all know that body can feel and express emotions, but body can also think. So only a sensorial education on remembering and forgetting can reach the youngsters' souls and make the knowledge of Holocaust a real educative and political tool. This is why I've called my speech a Scent of Memory. Maybe you remember the movie Scent of a Woman, an interesting play on coming of age of a troubled boy with a blind grown-up. I think it was Al Pacino. I don't remember if Al Pacino or Dustin Hoffman. All we have to do is to give memory a scent, a color, a tactile sensation, a sound. Memory can be sweet or sour, can be black or pink, can be smooth or velvety. Out of metaphors, this means that we can talk of dehumanization of deportees, starting from the sensation and the experiences boys and girls live in their everyday lives. For instance, we can talk about the freezing nights in camps, making the pupil think about the cold they feel in a winter night. We can talk about the dehumanizing right of spoiling and tattooing victims, starting from their shame when they are naked or half naked in front of other boys and girls. We can talk about stereotypes and prejudice, making them think about their prejudice, that imagine when they call a friend a nigger, faggot, bitch, sissy, and so on. Of course, this is very important, of course, the shame, the cold, the insults are not the same that occurred to victims of Holocaust. Of course, we are not reliving the same situations, but the emotional/rational experience of a man who is forced to undress in front of other men, of other deportees, is conceivable, in my opinion, only if we link it with our sense of body and nudity and modesty. If not, it remains merely an abstract thing, and it does not imply our emotional and rational involvement. So, we must speak about the stink of excrements inside the camp and the smell of violets that means new life for the ones who were saved, as my friend deportee Alberto Camerani once said. He said that the first smell outside the camp was the smell of violets, the smell of life. We must speak about the roughness of camp uniforms and the softness of the green grass in which deportees were lying in their first morning outside the camp. We must speak of the roughness of Nazi German language, the lingua tertium imperi for Primo Levi, and the sweetness of the French translation from Dante, Levi chose for his friend Jean, and so on, trying to draw a sort of sensorial map of terror and resistance, a sensorial map of humiliation and liberation, a sensorial map of memory. The sentence in the upper left corner is liking is not helping. It refers to the I like option on Facebook. Liking is not helping. This physical and sensorial idea of memory means, in my opinion, a hard critics to the ongoing rhetorics on the so-called new technologies. Is it possible to remember within the World Wide Web? Is it possible to remember when erasing of the past and undervaluation of memory is inscribed in the structure of the medium most used by youngsters? Is it possible to teach young people to collect and save memory when a website is erasing and losing memories forever under the choice of a webmaster? When a blog or a social network is destroying the memory of a post, just sliding it down in the page. When websites are refreshed daily and are losing forever their contents without justification and without explanation. How can a 14-year-old boy feel the scent of memory? Thanks. If he is locked in his room in front of a screen that reduces the use of his body to his fingerprints? We need a sensorial education that can go on also when the screens are blank and the plugs are disconnected. Of course, I'm not saying that computers and internet are useless in educating to remembering and forgetting. I'm not saying this. But they are just tools that may be used very carefully and must never substitute the physical and sensorial education. A person who has a computer has memory. Human beings have what in Italian is called ricordo. It's not remembering. Ricordo means recordare, put again in my heart. Cor is heart. Put again in my heart. Put in my heart again. Because a recollected memory, a living memory, can make my heart tremble and vibrate just as it did when I was living the experience I am now remembering. Computer cannot do this. And we must not ask it to do this, in my opinion. So finally, to conclude, we need a sensorial education that we can learn from the Jewish mothers that cook sweets in order to teach their children Jewish alphabet. The sweets, that you can see there, are shaped like letters and they are eaten by children while their mother is telling them ancient Jewish legends, one for each letter. I think that doing so, these mothers are teaching the alphabet, of course, but what is most important, they are teaching their children the scent of memory, the taste of learning, and also the joy of living. Thank you very much.
Well, I started my comments by talking about the technology that I would use to time these speakers, and I hear an emerging, although tremendously divergent theme about technologies arising from the speakers up to this point. Our next speaker is Gitanjali Pindaya, and who comes from Goldsmiths University in London. She's in her first year of a PhD in cultural studies. She has an MA in arts management and a BA in applied arts. She has several papers under review at the current time, including Framing the Dodo, From Ethnographic Archive to Contemporary Memory, Excursions Art Journal, University of Sussex, Truth Commissions and Memory of the State in the Journal of the Indian Ocean Region. And she has a published article towards an intercultural manifesto, an intercultural conference, and Diversité culturelle et interculturelle, telle assise pour la paix. And she is involved with a research project now on non-archival memoriography. When did a certain historiography become nomological? Her research is an attempt to understand why cultural memory in the literary and artworks has taught her more about her history than state-sponsored history books. Memoriography does not reproduce counter-narratives, but fluid and dynamic archives of the future which act as prospection, as a determiner of future action, while history delves into past memories as retrospection and affirms its authority based on its scientism. So a little preview of her ideas, and now we'll hear from Gitanjali Pindaya.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
So I am now in my second year PhD in cultural studies. Started 2 weeks ago at Goldsmith. My research is greatly influenced by my background in visual arts and media theory and the influence of cultural studies. Less of the Birmingham Marxist and psychoanalytical approach, but following a more contemporary direction in the field, especially in critical theory and philosophy. Using deconstruction to Foucault's discourse on power, to feminist theory via Butler and Braidotti, which I'm still exploring, I am building upon the framework of memoriography. So I explore two forms of memorial framework. The first one, institutional framework of remembrance, focusing on state narratives in commemoration and history subjects in the UK. And second, the resistance to institutional memory in the forms of literature, visual or performative arts. For this paper, I discussed the reading of Anne Frank's diary in the context of a project on World War II by pupils of Year 7, which is the last year of primary school in the UK. In my research, I questioned whether literature, diaries, witness accounts, art and music are only an alternative form of memory, discarded by historians who do not discuss the genuinely subjective aspect of memory with all its contradictions and flaws, because it cannot be encapsulated in a clearly structured narrative. Many historians evidently discard what they consider operating on the periphery of the discipline. Historians discard oral histories as a crisis of expert discourse and a calling into question the pedagogical authority of the historian, or not a very useful historical source. All those were quoted from Peter Carrier. And hence feel threatened by memory studies which have brought forward memorial distortions of knowledge, whether of the Holocaust, of Eurocentric historiographies of colonialism, slavery or indenture, which is an aspect of my research. The memory of silence, of recollection, and even amnesia is not engaged empirically by historians, affirming the reductionist aspect of historiography. And when I say historians here, I'm specifically referring to my case study, which is on the Mauritius Islands. The study of memory compels historians to deal with questions concerning epistemology, politics, religion, ethics, and language. This paper, which will be a chapter of my thesis, analyzes history projects in primary schools in relation to memories of World War II and the Holocaust. I first analyzed the education framework of the Ministry of Education, the topics selected, and finally the outcomes in the projects by students and the narratives. In the UK, I found that very specific events were selected in the national curriculum and projected to children in an approach which sanitizes and renders abstract, this is the term that they actually use in the framework, terms like colonialism, empire, Holocaust, slavery, to fit in the meta-narratives of British history. The institutionalization of memory becomes clear when I analyze the final projects and how the pupils read and interpreted the topic. A similar study that Felicitas did, but I only concentrated on the final projects. A slide chart to explain the framework which I'm using. So I use a framework which I'm still developing. This chart hopefully summarizes a Derridian-Foucauldian interpretation of the institutionalization of memory. Memory moves from the private domain to its public institutionalization. I wish to argue in my research that historiographies via its institutionalization take the form of an archive, which ontologically derive its authority from its institutional topology. As soon as an edited text is institutionalized, it becomes devoid of affective force. My ongoing analysis of literary works and politically engaged contemporary works brings me to reflect on their non-authoritative narrative, its dynamism and fluidity, and the power to provoke affect. Departing from here, I wish to develop the notion of memoriography from first the anarchival impulse of performative artists who contest the authority ascribed to archival documents and state historiographies. The artist feels the impulse to unarchive, that is, to produce counter-narratives with new perspectives to well-established histories and perceptions. What I find challenging at this point of my research is to argue that memoriography is not only a body of counter-narratives, but an affective force which propels and mobilizes memory for change. I developed the concept of memoriography as a body of creative works which deal with the way in which an event is recalled and understood in the present, not as an alternative form of memory, but as a mnemonic tool with prospective potentialities which transcend institutional memory. Before I elaborate on the history projects which I analyzed for this paper, I also analyze how the World War II is historically depicted in British ex-colonies. I analyze the archival process of the Truth and Justice Commission in Mauritius in turning private memories into public documents, to the memoriography in place in literary works, theater protests, music, visual arts, and language dynamics. I analyze a literary fiction digging into an aspect of historiography which will never be institutionalized based on the argument of my research. The literary fiction, written by a Mauritian author, uses as backdrop to her work the history of a group of 1,500 Jewish people from Poland, Australia, and Czechoslovakia, abandoned in 1940 on the island of Mauritius, then a British colony. This historical event is only propelled forward through a fictional novel, which I argue can one day form part of literary textbooks prescribed to pupils in schools. Unfortunately, the text doesn't fit in the colonial memorial framework institutionalized in the post-colony. Coming back to the institutional use of Anne Frank diary in history projects, I argue that it has enormous prospective memorial potential, but when I analyze the final projects of pupils, I notice a lack of engagement with the issues of human suffering, genocide, and the culture of militarization. The project which I analyze almost glorify the war and present the war in forms of weapon and technology. Most pupils wrote about ants having to cut her hair in the concentration camp and dying of typhus. There were almost no forms of empathy and little questioning of Anne's disruptive life. I also found out that the pupils did not read the diary, but read the summary provided in the project pack. The affective potential of the diary in the analysis of subjective experiences and mobilizing for change is rendered ineffective as a public institutionalization of private memories. Anne's experience is commemorated almost as a spectacle and Holocaust tourism, pushing us to remain forever oriented towards journeying to that historically defining event in the history of humanity. We are forever doomed to amnesia, as Hussein puts it. We consume history so as to forget it. Another striking and problematic title used in several projects that I analyze is The Adventure in France, the title that they give by many pupils when depicting the heroism of British soldiers on the D-Day in relation to the invasion of Normandy. The projects fit perfectly in support of a state historiography evoking a British collective memory of heroism. And again, I go back to your project about how great the British Empire is, the same narrative I found. One of the aims for the subject of history taught in schools, as stipulated from the framework document of the national curriculum in England, is to, I quote, changes within living memory and events beyond living memory that are significant nationally or globally, end quote. The project which I analyze supports my argument that institutional memory do not allow for a non-nomological memory. Nomological being an imposition of a certain truth which becomes rigid and archival. The vicious cycle of historical narratives being perpetuated in textbooks, then to the reader, then back to repeating the same historical narratives can be seen in the glorification of British politics during the war and of colonization empire, which I also analyze. The framework document of the national curriculum in England even refers to terms like colonialism, empire, Holocaust, slavery as abstract. Actually, the word abstract. That abstraction of exploitative systems and humans' inhumanity is well perpetuated throughout the syllabus. Anne Frank's diary is relegated to an institutional framework to be analyzed as peripheric documents of the national projection of glorified British history. Another aspect of which I am still working on is the idea of chronological and historical temporality. It's very much emphasized in the project with timelines explaining the duration of the war, dates of birth, dates of invasion. I'm still exploring that aspect. Upon the works of Parisi and Goodman, who are cultural theorists in cultural studies, who propose a framework of achronological time, which breaks the linearity of the traditional archive. I think someone presented something on that linearity. Yeah, I think you mentioned that as well. I argue that the projects are not dealing with living memory, but institutional memory that is significant as a state apparatus. I wish to argue that memories are prospective, as they exist as ways of determining future actions. Those memories cannot be archived because they are creating an archive of the future. I thus explore the notion of prospective memory and affective power to reflect on creative works as provoking bodily memory. Holocaust survivors' works reflect not only the form and content as survivor testimony, but also institutes a category of memory that becomes at the same time an aesthetic category. This affective or sense memory operates through the body to produce a kind of seeing truth rather than thinking truth, registering the pain of memory as it is directly experienced and communicating a level of bodily affect. The arts, unlike science, promotes open-ended inquiry. It can embrace the unknown, the abject, the amoral, like Foucault would say, the aberrant, not as pathology, but as experience. Bennett, who also writes on visual arts and aesthetics of trauma, believes that traumatic memory is of a non-declarative type, involving bodily responses that lie outside verbal, semantic, linguistic representations. At this point in my research, I'm investigating the affective force of literary works, which not only contest institutional memory, but which have the potential to mobilize for change. I think I also wanted to add that I follow Raphael's idea of making education allowing us to look at evil in our everyday life as the most purpose of an education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gitanjali. If I can expand my role of the chair a little bit, I just see another emerging theme which we might discuss in the short time that we will have for discussion, and that is the role of affect in memory and history, which clearly is emerging in each of the papers. The next presentation is from Maria Georgiou from the Institute of Education at the University of London. Maria comes from Cyprus and since 2005 has split her time between London and Nicosia. Currently, she is undertaking her thesis at the Institute of Education at the University of London, exploring students' understanding of historical narrative accounts. Her field work takes place in Cyprus, a divided country with an especially traditional educational system. Her research interests include the theorization of history, memory and society, and identity. In 2012-13, she worked as a history education teacher trainer at the European University of Cyprus. She previously worked on the development of supplementary educational material for first Historiana, a digital educational platform, and second, for the Association for Historical Dialogue and Research in Cyprus. Her ongoing professional development includes participation in the Teaching American History program, Slavery at the Crossroads, on a Fulbright scholarship, and the completion of the History Educational Professional Development Certificate at Cambridge University. Maria.
Good morning. Is that okay? Good morning, and a big thank you to the organizers for this amazing conference. So, my paper is about school versus memory. The purpose of this paper is to address the relationship between memory and history, and discuss some of the implications of this relationship for school and history education. In specific, the question I will attempt to answer is whether history and memory are parasitic to each other or whether they can coexist. First of all, I would like to start this paper by illustrating its stimuli. Though each case is very different, this paper draws its inspiration from Cyprus. Cyprus has experienced a quite troubled 20th century, with the results of conflict being still there. After the War of 1974, the island has been de facto divided, with the two communities living separately. As Cyprus has been experiencing an overload of history, a term that Papadakis has used, he's an anthropologist, and he has used it extensively to indicate history and memory complementing or replacing each other. So as Cyprus has been experiencing an overload of history, I consider the Cyprus case especially relevant to the Balkan and Central European countries. Now, to start with, before tackling the memory-history relationship, there are two issues I would like to pose. One, I consider it very important to define the two terms of the equation. Both terms pertain to the past, and the past acquires its double sense of having been and no longer being. Additionally, history, tradition, memory, myth, and memoir variously join us with what has passed with forebears, with our earlier selves. Furthermore, what makes things even more complicated is that not only both terms refer to the past, but these diverse routes to the past are neither fixed nor firmly bounded. They overlap and they shift their focus. Now, the second step of inquiry is to assess their relationship. As pointed above, not only both terms refer to the past, but they overlap. Actually, I would argue that the two terms are inevitably conjoined. After all, don't memory and history merge and interact through everyday experience? And what is more, don't they merge and interplay through academic practice? Would one examine the origins and development of historiography, history and memory do connect. We should remember that articulation between history and memory was fostered above all by the national state, and that early professional historians passed from king's chroniclers to monarchic state officials commissioned to tailor the nation's memory. History was invented to serve the state and inform people of their common ancestry, culture, language, and often religion. In a few words, history was invented to inform people about their common memory. However, things have changed. Today we tend to talk a lot about memory, and memory has gained a prominent position. Nora explains that this synthesis came apart after the coupling of the state and nation was gradually replaced by the coupling of the state and society. So what has become important now is society. Today, as individuals, we cannot rely on the support of collective memory in the same way people did before. The task now became one of finding usable pasts capable of serving the new groups. Looking backwards, the national narrations told by historians, once thought to be emerging in the light of universal history, may now crudely look partial. So we have today what we call democratization of memory. Why do we then discuss history versus memory? Well, it depends on what kind of history we refer to. Since this conference is about school memory and history, we should make the distinction between school history and scholar epistemological history. And by doing so, I do not imply that students should become mini historians. So national history does not necessarily clash with memory, as despite its pure motives, it rather resembles memory. In reality, a school education played a central role in the origins and building of national state. School history has been more inclined to install a collective memory rather than history. Nonetheless, most curricula claim that students come to school to learn history, that is, the study of the past, and not to commit to the memory of the past. Hence, with history education making a turn in epistemological history, in the following section, I will discuss history as an epistemology rather than national narrative, which is what school does. Explicitly, I will refer to history as the inquiry about the past and memory as a mechanism that seeks to revive the past. The ideas which I would like to discuss here represent neither a conclusive theory nor a methodology. This paper seeks to give some provisional answers. After all, finding an answer to this question has exercised thinkers for many years and will undoubtedly continue to do so for many more. So with this paper, I aim to make a preliminary and tentative attempt to tease out the ways in which history and memory connect, clash, and at the same time the ways in which they can coexist in history education curriculum and classroom. Discussion structure. So, having already defined the two terms and discussing their relationship, I will proceed in addressing how memory and history clash. I will do so by discussing memory-specific characteristics. I will facilitate reference and discussion in the form of 10 points. Unfortunately, I cannot discuss this extensively, but I will try to do them justice. After all, I have to say that each of these points could be a thesis or many theses by themselves. Following, I will take the stance that as history is a rational epistemological construction, memory and history clash with important implications on history education. Thirdly, for all the clashes between history and memory, I will argue that history and memory can coexist in a symbiotic model, that is, through an inclusive form of historical consciousness. 1. Memory is selective. To start with, memory is intrinsic to humans. After all, no human can escape memory. Memory through recollection is what gives us recollection of who we have been. With no memory, we cannot encode, store, and retrieve information. Now, speaking about memory necessarily means speaking about forgetting, because no one cannot remember everything. A memory with no gaps would be an unbearable burden. It is a cliché to say that memory is selective. However, memory forgetting is not always innocent. Forgetting is a quite debated concept as it refers to the psychological defense mechanism in which people forget unwanted memories. We also have other factors coming into the scene: gender, age, sequence of events. Hence, memory becomes selective and does not function like an archive where everything is potentially available. 2. Defining the self. Through selectiveness, memory becomes a vital tool in defining who we are and often who we would like to be. Our present needs call for specific memories. Through our own memory, we can find our place in history. To own a piece of the past can promote a fruitful connection with it. Parades have replaced cemetery pilgrimages as the typical Memorial Day activity. Now it became possible for women, even those who had not been mobilized, to feel that they too have been a part of the history. And I bring this example to say that through memories or through others' memories, we feel part of the bigger picture. In summary, although the status of memory and identity is relatively recent, the parallel lives of these two terms alert us to the fact that the notion of identity depends on the idea of memory, and vice versa. Aligning the self to the community. Memory, besides intrinsic to the individual human, is also necessary to groups and society. People do not remember in isolation, but only with help from the memories of others. Through memories of memories, individuals become part of the community. Individuals build their own memories through memories of memories. And before, we had the example of the post-communist children of the revolution, being an exact reflection of this phenomenon. History as a panacea. History is used for healing, either with excessive remembering or forgetting. Memory dictates and history writes. Both history and memory fall to the rules of narrative. However, they use different mechanisms of narrative. A lot has been said, and I hope that we'll hear some more on the role of narrative, of memory and history. The point I would like to raise here is that narrative is used differently in memory and history, connecting to an eternal time. As memory ensures continuity between the past and the present, memory promotes continuity. Memory is a bond tying us to the eternal present. Breeding morality. The past is most characteristically invoked for the lessons it teaches. And an essential task of memory is breeding the moral subject. I would like to use the example of Cyprus here. After the War of 1974, Greek Cypriots have used the phrase, "I do not forget," then ξεχνώ. Now, a few years later on, we had the slogan of, "I do not forget that I should not forget." No one thinks that it's important to remind us what we should not forget. The important thing is to be moral subjects and not forget. It doesn't really matter what. Mythologizing and beautifying the past. Just like morality, mythologizing is central to the nationalistic narratives. However, mythologizing and beautifying inevitably leads to significant omissions and distortions. 9. The safety of heritage. Through the past, through a beautified past, we create heritage and we feel proud of it. 10. Memory is personal. We are more likely to do our own memory work at times and places of our own choosing. And although each person operates through collective memory, we often do so through a DIY. What do I mean? We often mix and match, and we often copy and paste from collective memory so as to define ourselves. Again, with memory being personal, the practical past is different for each one of us. Now, having defined the specific characteristics of memory, I would like to point out that history, in opposition to memory, is a rational construction. It is a world structured to have meaning and make sense. Implication 1. History is a mirror of the past. As seen above, memory seeks to revive. As long as history is mistaken for memory and a mirror reflecting the past, students fail to see history as a rational methodological construction. Accordingly, students fail to see that as historical narratives are constructions, it is in their nature to differ, and that the meaning of what has happened is not fixed and once and for all. Implication 2. Both making history and storing are human needs. They are both valid, but with history taking a more prominent position, we have a competing situation where students feel they have to appropriate. What students fail to see here is that they are both valid, but they are doing different things. A symbiotic relationship? Yes. It can be a symbiotic relationship in the sense that history can include memory. The lessons of memory can be transformed by the expectation of the future and are not entirely inaccessible to the historian. It is only memory which turns again in a renewed way to the future and restores the link between the work of a historian and historical consciousness, which is how history and memory can coexist. And lastly, the loose ends. Last but not least, I will close with the remark that I consider this paper incomplete as it has not taken the challenge of applying theory to practice. Since this conference is about school, the question how do we move past abstract theory to effective practice, in simple words, what a teacher can do should not be overlooked. A future paper should also indicate the possibilities and specific teaching and learning practices that the memory-history relationship can yield. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I rushed the paper. I'm looking forward for questions, suggestions, and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for paying such careful attention to the time. Our next speaker is Marcel Tomasek, who is in the Faculty of Humanities at Charles University in Historical Sociology. He's a sociologist living in Prague, lecturing and conducting research on social change and collective memory at Charles University. He previously taught at the School of Social Studies at Masaryk University in Brno. He initiated and was one of the main organizers of the postgraduate conference Life in Motion, Shifting Spaces, Transcending Times, Crossing Borders in June 2007 in Brno. Besides his research on various aspects of social change, he lectures various MA-level qualitative methodology courses at the Department of Historical Sociology at Charles University. He has previously studied or undertaken research stays at Aarhus University in Denmark, Miami University in the United States, the New School for Social Research, also in the United States, Central European University, and the Graduate School for Social Research in Warsaw, Poland. Marcel Tomasek.
Well, thank you very much for introduction. I'm going to, in my presentation, to jump a bit into like empirical side in a way. However, I will start by describing the research which I undertaken as a qualitative part of larger research on memory and historical consciousness. If I move, to this like larger picture from which I then get closer to this like very empirical side, yes. So this is actually the description of the research. So I'm actually referring to the research which has been published in Slovak Sociological Review. So there is like bibliographical information about this research, which was, as I mentioned, concentrated on historical consciousness within the Czech context, and it had like quantitative part and a qualitative part. So the things which I'm going to present are from this qualitative part of the study, and actually the article and the research started from establishing some usual theoretical and methodological stands undertaken now within the field of collective memory research, and just to show that, actually the result of this theoretical part is this schema, which in left column covers like very usual and established methodological and theoretical standpoints from which we usually approach collective memory, and in the right column, actually, those are the approaches which are more recent and which are in a way somehow challenging the previous ones or developing them further. But I don't want to focus entire attention during the presentation on that. This is just like the way how I was like getting to the material I'm to present to you. So essentially, to get away from this theoretical part of the study and to move to empirical part, we actually did eight focus groups on historical consciousness in 4 middle range cities within the Czech Republic: Hradec Králové, Jihlava, Most, and Olomouc. And the focus groups have been set up in a such way that 4 of them have been with general, without any regard of profession, established groups, and 4 of them have been actually focus groups with the teachers of history at this elementary and secondary schools. Just in order to keep somehow the structure, I will tell you like what was this regarding the title of my presentation. What are this main kind of revelation of this qualitative research, which involved actually, 4 groups of teachers. Each group had like roughly 10 teachers. It's a result of dealing with some 40 accounts of teaching and having relation to history. Essentially, when we come to these teachers' ways and strategies when dealing with dictated history instruction content in pre-1989 period in the Czech context, in those accounts of the teachers, I actually established like 3 essential models or categories of how they actually gone through that, and essentially we can state them as you see on the PowerPoint. So the first group we could describe as kind of learned schizophrenia, meaning that teachers essentially been teaching lies, and they've been like cautious of that, even though they perfectly knew that those are lies, and they learn to be actually in a way schizophrenic. So that could that I could identify like as one group. The other group we could describe as teaching to think, and the third group could be highlighted as like attempt of avoiding or skipping the sensitive periods, meaning like mainly 20th century or like second half of the 20th century history. And now I will try to work with this very empirical or very particular part. So I will get to the actual quotations from which I derive these categories. So I would encourage you to try to read, because they are quite long, so I'm not going to read them. But let's see. Actually, this first quotation actually relates to that what I described as learned schizophrenia. So this quotation actually describes the situation of this teacher who grown up in the family which was pretty much unconscious of this like in her family, the environment in the family actually went with the communist regime. There were no kind of oppositions or discussions disagreeing with the regime, except what is described as like this from time to time, like this the fathers leaving the bounds of costume and decency, but it was considered as very exceptional, like when this teacher was growing up. And actually she found out about this true essence of the regime only like when getting married to her husband, whose family had relatives in the West, and that's when the time of this revelation and finding the truth about this relation of history and the communist regime came out. So let's move to next one. This group which I described, teaching to think. It's a reference of a teacher who has been like teaching for very long, even before 1989, for some, let's say, 10 years before 1989, and actually her way of dealing with that problem was that even within the limits of those textbooks given by the regime before 1989, she was trying to encourage students to think. You know, and she sort of reconnected to the way she was taught, like when she was growing up and being schooled, so she was actually quite disagreeing with the previous respondent, who, you know, and saying that actually even without that schizophrenia you could working with the books, given that there was a way to make the students to be eager to find out, and you know, to sort of challenge the established account of history within the communist regime. And actually, what she's noticing is that the students actually have been even more eager to do that than today. Yes. So as we have last 5 minutes, so we move to the third person, or third group of possible attitude, and we could describe this as avoiding and skipping the sensitive periods, and it's actually a reference of a male teacher who describes this situation regarding how the collaboration of the Soviet Union and Germany in starting the Second World War, how it was actually dealt. You know, so he actually describes the situation, how actually if a person had real interest to find out that even within the context of this communist regime, it was possible to find out, like being a teacher, and in order not to participate in this lying and spreading like this distorted account of history by the communist regime, he actually had tried always to actually finish his instruction by the start of the Second World War, you know, to avoid like dropping into this distorted account. So that was this third group. Just to conclude, you know, I was referring to the situation before 1989. How the situation has changed after 1989? Is it like so nice and happy now, like to teach? Of course, there are like certain problems. You know, initially we could imply that those problems are connected with the teachers who have been like pro-regime teachers and after 89 still teaching, but speaking now, 20 years on, this is not actually anymore the substantial agenda to deal with. But but still, even today, actually, we deal with that problem that students of history at elementary and secondary schools frequently don't reach that stage of modern history or current history, and even without that presses which were common before 1989, like to limit that or to deal with that problem. So what are the reasons for that? Well, essentially, you know, even after 1989, now 20 years on, when we can lecture freely, this most current history is frequently left off by teachers at their free will, because they sort of don't want to deal with the history which is not yet kind of stable and solid. You know, so this is usually like the main reason why they sort of hesitate like to go farther into, you know, like 70s and 80s, you know. So that would be probably one problem. And the other problem is, of course, like a time allocated to teaching of history and human sciences today, which is the problem because at first at some schools this time have been reduced, but at the same time there's like another huge influence or huge factor by pointing of which I will end up my presentation, and it is this required introduction of school educational programs, which is like the ordered procedure by the Ministry of Education, where each school has to actually adapt their individual historic or other social sciences program. And it creates problem because there is this requirement of applying this integrated instruction for the all human sciences and like what we call in Czech school by play, which takes time for the classical frontal instruction and may limit actually do the instruction. Thanks a lot for the attention.
Thank you very much, Marcel. Our final speaker on this panel is Jocelyn Letourneau from the University of Laval in Quebec, Canada. A member of the Royal Society of Canada, Dr. Letourneau is Canada Research Chair in the History of Contemporary Quebec, Laval University. In past years, he was History for the Future, Rewriting Memory and Identity in Quebec Today, from 2004, Le Québec, les Québécois, un parcours historique, que veulent les Québécois, from L'Oréal in 2006, and Le Québec entre son passé et sa passage. He has just published Je me souviens, le passé du Québec dans la conscience de sa jeunesse. Professor Letourneau.
Well, thanks, Peter. I'm very conscious of my time slot, so I'll try to be quick, clear, and not too cheap. I'm from Quebec, a typical North American francophone, supposedly postmodern society. Yet, histories and memories are all around. They nourish representations that people, including youth, draw on to build their sense of belonging to a place and a community. I have to disappoint gurus of the post-historical age, but we have not entered such a moment in the evolution of humankind where histories and memories are out. Quite the opposite, they still matter. A long time ago, Aristotle said that human beings are by nature political animals. We could add that they are historical animals as well, meaning that they rely on histories and memories to make sense of themselves in time and space. This is one of the evidence that comes from a large survey I did with colleagues, including Peter, on Canadians and their pasts. Well, here we are. Parallel to this survey, I undertook a second large study that produced its first consistent results some months ago. It is common to hear, in Quebec at least, that young people are not interested in history and know very little about the past of their society. The teaching of history in the province is largely based on the second of these premises, which states that youth is ignorant about the past. Thus, we teach the kids as if they were empty pots and as if the classroom was the only place they learn about the past. On this basis, we try to transfer to kids as much historical information as possible on a range of historical subjects as large as possible. As if the kids were endless takers, we try also to teach them a lot of intellectual competencies. The more the better, that's the motto that seems to drive the business of teaching history nowadays in our societies. I'll be frank with you, I'm not convinced that teaching history to kids based on the rule, the more you can eat in the buffet of the past, is the best idea we have had. First, and this is one of the outcomes of my study, kids are not ignorant, or at least they are not completely ignorant about the past. Most of the time, we come to this conclusion because kids fail to answer specific questions on what that has been. Who was the first Premier of Quebec is an example of such stupid questions we challenge kids with. But who really cared about who was the first Premier of Quebec? Moreover, it's not a big deal for a kid to find information if he's allowed a smartphone connected to internet to make his search. Those who have children, and I have 4 of them, know that in our times, smartphone is not a fashionable device only affluent students carry with them. It's a standard tool a young person is equipped with to live its everyday existence. So instead of relying on trivia quiz to get into kids' historical knowledge of the past, I employed a different way. Coming into classroom without warning, whoops, I'm sorry, this should not be, anyway. No, here we are. Coming into classroom without warning, I asked students 2 very broad questions for which they had 45 minutes to answer. Tell me the history of Quebec from the beginning as you know it was the first question, and the second was, if you had to summarize the historical experience of Quebec in a phrase, what would you write personally? In a period of 10 years, I gathered close to 5,000 texts, some having 3 paragraphs, other 3 pages, produced by students across Quebec and aged 15 to 25. I also accumulated 4,000 phrases crafted by the same respondents. This is one of the largest corpus of that sort in the world. And so far, the idea of doing such a research has been replicated in Australia, in France, in Catalonia, in Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, and in Francophone Canada as well. In this talk, I'm not going to get into the details of the study, about which you can have a lot of details in visiting the website whose address is on the screen. I will not speak either about all the outcomes of my study. I will simply insist on 2 points that seem crucial to me. Let me pitch them straight. About the past, kids know more than what we think they do. And kids are endowed with many representations about the past of their society, representations they do acquire through socialization within their community, through discussions with parents and grandparents, through TV series or movies they watch, through comics, fiction, and all sorts of books they read, through songs they listen to, through exhibitions in museums they see or historical parks they visit, through political discourse they hear, even unattentively, and so on and so forth. The fact is that kids come in the classroom with a baggage of informations and representations. And basically this is that baggage mixed with what they've got from previous teaching that they offer to me when asked to tell the story of Quebec as they know it. Now, what is their baggage composed of? I'd say it's a blend of different things, including hard facts, more or less accurate with reality, cliches, gross representations, opinions, images of different sorts, catchwords, personal views, given interpretations, slogan, metaphors, you name them. Together, these elements spin, consolidate, harden, and as time goes on, develop in what I call a matrix of understanding. Matrix that helps kids to take hold and make sense of past worlds. The drawing on the screen, which might be a little bit complicated, illustrate my point. Now I must stress on 3 things. First, I'd be the last to say that the so-called matrix of understanding leads a kid to develop a sophisticated view and understanding even less of the past. On the contrary, the matrix simplifies and clarifies everything. In the perspective of the matrix, the shape and content of the past are not any more obscure, they become crystal clear. For historians who shall worry incessantly that past might be too neat, this is a concern. Second point, that a matrix of understanding brings simplistic rather than complicated views of the past does not mean that it's fragile in its structure and may be easily overturned. The opposite is true indeed. Visions of the past brought by the matrix are strong precisely because they are simplistic. Third point, more than actual facts, a matrix of understanding is fundamental in building historical consciousness in kids. To me, historical consciousness is not reducible to historical knowledge. While historical knowledge is about informations of different kinds of the past, historical consciousness is about the articulation of those informations in a meta-vision that gives sense to the undeterminacies of what that has been, so the present becomes situated and the future expected in connection with the past. If, as teacher willing to transmit to kids balanced interpretations of the past and historical competencies as well, we are careless about the fact that these kids, before entering school, are already full of conceptions about what that has been, and if we are unaware these conceptions supplied by community memories, family memories, and all sorts of historical discourses are strong rather than weak and cannot be easily deconstructed, for they are constantly reinforced outside the class, then we may fail to impact on young people's historical mind. So, what is to be done? After completing my study, I came to the conclusion that teaching history to kids as if they were intellectually immaculate is wrong. Indeed, one of the main findings is to say that we shall not address ignorance as if it was a void to fill, but a content to deal with. In that context, we have to start from where kids are. Where are they? Well, most of them are in the myth histories of their community of belonging. Myth histories can be defined as basic stories around which communities, societies, nations, or countries are built. A myth history combines a lot of ideological and empirical elements tied in such a way that it is difficult to separate discourse from facts. Knowing those stories is for someone to bond his personal destiny to collective endeavor. Myth histories are crucial in the manufacturing of groups of all kinds, either they are gangs or nations. Myth histories articulate history, memory, and identity in strong narrations of the group for the group. Starting from where kids are is the first step, it seems to me, for teaching them history a pragmatic way. Second step is to challenge kids in their knowledge with the aim of taking them outside the basic matrix of understanding, which is the foundation of their historical consciousness. Challenging the kids in their myth stories is to open the door to possibly move them out of a space of thinkable, so they may enter what could be called a space of unthinkable about the past. I will illustrate my point with an example taken from Quebec. The conquest of New France by the British in 1759 is one of the main myth history upon which a specific representation of Quebec nation is built. Every kid knows about this taking over. Now this moment in the past, which is an unquestionable fact, is also the opening chapter of a narration of survival and resistance that kids rely on to depict Quebec's trajectory in time. In telling Quebec's past from and through the episode of the conquest and other similar myth histories that, when tied together, create a course in the sense of Quebec's historical experience, kids are trapped in a thinkable that prevent them to seeing a different way what that has been. This is the teacher's duty to take kids out of a narration of the past so they may acquire a more complex view about the conquest, its causes and consequences, changes it brought and continuities reinforced, its real historical significance consequently, and so on and so forth. Causes and consequences, continuity and change, historical significance. We recognize here some basic concepts of the historical thinking paradigm developed by Seychelles, Lévesque, and others. In discordance with some advocates of this paradigm, though, I don't see it as an end in itself. For me, historical thinking is a means to bring kids to a more complex representations of the past. In my opinion, to propose to kids representations of the past is an unavoidable goal, if not the central goal of teaching history. The historically minded kid is not only a person who knows how to question the past, it's also a person who knows something positive or concrete about the past. Then I go to my third step, last step. This leads me to, which is, after having challenged or contested, if not deconstructed, myth history that kids are bearers of or embedded in, we have to provide the kids with alternative visions of history, visions more complex than those they had for sure, but visions still structured as big representations. vision structured as big representations, would say someone? Yes. Except for the few who wish to become historians and make the complexities of the past their daily bread, the vast majority of kids just want to get broad knowledge and general ideas that help them to make sense of the past, so they don't look stupid when they participate in a conversation about history, and such conversations happen more than we think. In this context, the task of teachers is to propose a structured, alternative knowledge to kids. Indeed, I believe that kids must not be left in a mess of interpretations about the past because they get easily lost. On the contrary, we have to provide them with a problematic, that is to say, a frame that organizes the vagueness and multidimensionality of the past into something that can be grasped and understood. Of course, I'm thinking here of a frame that is open, pluralistic, and soft rather than closed, monovalent, and hard. I'm not going to detail what could be such a problematic in any particular case. I'm just going to say that teachers should leave kids with something to hook on, sort of general structure of understanding that kids can grapple in order to make sense with something. If it's true that some young people are receptive to multiple perspective and plural interpretations on the past, it appears that most are seeking for clarity over complexity. This should not shock. More often than otherwise, the necessity for sense supplants the obligation of truth. This can be verified in kids as well as in adults, including you and me. We resist to drown ourselves in the infinite complexity of things. We have problem to accept the unbearable lightness of being. Relying on big representations is for humans a way to keep their heads over the waters of history instead of sinking into the floods of the past. One more minute, Mr. President. Before I finish, I'd like to address a last question. Is it worth to try to transfer to kids as much content as possible about the past? According to what I said previously, I suggest that instead of trying to touch as many aspects as possible about the past, the course is structured around the myth-histories kids possessed. In other words, to impact the most on kids' historical consciousness, we should address first the main pictures or frames of reference around which their understanding and visions of the past are structured. If I am in empathy with those who say that teaching should not be reduced to transferring useful or practical knowledge, we should aim at improving the humanistic culture of youth, I believe also that in order to maximize the effect we have upon kids regarding their historical knowledge and historical consciousness, we stick to what they need to live efficiently in society. We should not forget that most kids are not interested to acquire a vast historical culture. To become antiquarians or worse, historians is not their cup of tea. What they want, besides good grades, is to get that knowledge that may serve them in concrete life situations. At this time, a lot of what is taught to kids doesn't make sense to them because it's useless and meaningless. In that context, I think that the challenge to teaching the past is to lead kids to have a different look at those events, moments, and processes that are useful or meaningful to them and that help them to build their sense of belonging to a society or a nation. Last very phrase. The aim of such a teaching would not be to deconstruct any reference and risk taking kids in a babel of sense. Rather, I'd say the goal would be to complexify the existing reference and to reopen the idea of society or nation so kids see themselves as historical beings and see their environment as an historical place a different way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. Because of the timing, we have just time for 2 questions. So we'll take 2 questions, and perhaps some of the extraordinary themes that have been raised by each of these speakers and all of these speakers can be revisited in further discussion, both over lunch and in future sessions during the conference. So, a question. Yes.
So I have the question.
Microphone.
I have a question to Raffaele, but maybe it will be also for other speakers. You insisted on sensual education, on experiencing education in order to remember more or remember deeply or something like that. But this is a very popular way which many projects will use now, and sometimes it leads to some curious situations that the children are trained to feel like the victims of communist prisons or something like that. And so my question is, what are the negative aspects of the sensual education? Thank you.
Very briefly, I think that the risk is to remain only on the ground of emotions, only on the ground of body. What we need is, after the experience, an attention to the categorization, to reason must come to play. I can make a kid do an experience, a physical experience, a sensorial experience, but the next stage is to think about it, to make comparison, so emotion and reason must be linked together. In our school, in Italy, in some school in Italy, you can find only reason, no emotion, no body, no physical education, or only physical education with no reason. The short circuit between reason and emotions, I think is given by body, because body can think. We have not a mind that thinks, we have a body that as a whole can think. So the risk is to remain only on the ground of emotions. Emotions must be nurtured by thinking, by comparison, by rational reason.
Thank you. Yes, Maria.
I have a question for Jocelyn. You said that history education should leave students with a general understanding, and that you should leave students with the knowledge that they need. So I'll play the devil's advocate and say, does this mean that we could skip, for example, the ancient or the medieval times altogether and do significance or continuity just in modern years?
My point was more related with the task of teaching what is usually called national history. I did not address the question of general history in my talk, and I'm very reluctant anyway to make any universal statement that could apply to any situation. So, just to come back to my main idea, national history, my point was to say that kids are coming into school with different informations about what's the past of their society. Those are kind of myth histories, and most kids need a kind of understanding of the past that is useful for them. And if we don't provide them with big ideas about the past, and if we just let them in a sort of mixed interpretation, that's possible to see things like this, that's possible to see things like this. At some point, many of my students told me, but when the course is over, when the class is over, students come to me and say, but what do you want that we put on our sheet? What would be the good interpretation? So I think that we've got to be the more complex as possible, but still we've got to let those people with something to hook on. Otherwise, and I don't know who said that this morning, but when the picture of things become too much confused, I mean, those people who have very simple ideas about anything, including the past, will come with the right answers to the bad questions, or with the good answers to the other way around, anyway. and people will grab it. And kids are not different than we are. I mean, we cannot control every situation. We are intellectuals, we are historians, we like to deal with complexities of the past, but most people, I mean, they just want to have a sort of clear picture of things, and if we don't provide them with something that is reasonably understandable, then we open the door very large for ideologists to fill up the void.
On that note, I think we will end the question period here and the discussion. I want to thank all of the panelists and thank you for your attentiveness during a long morning. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you very much for having this cruel role of cutting the discussion, because I think even the last words were very thought-provoking and might come with some, not resistance, but further questions and discussion. So for you not to starve at the very beginning of afternoon, may you please use the hour till 3 o'clock when we shall meet here back for the third session for your lunch. Instructions for possible places around here are available by the entrance, and I look forward for the third session, and thank you.